I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. I'm trying to view humanity from a distance, as aliens would see us from space. Today is November 21st, 2020. It's about 18 days since the presidential election in the United States, and about 14 days since media outlets announced the winner, Joe Biden, and the loser, Donald Trump. Now that was a nail-biter, believe me. Those 4 days between the election and the announcement of the winner were among the scariest of my life, and I'm including 2 brushes with cancer. It would have been truly terrible if Trump had won, and he very nearly did. 47% voted for him, or nearly half the electorate. Given his brutish, incompetent, and autocratic style, openly displayed for 4 years, he should have been stamped out in a landslide, but he wasn't. It was essentially a routine election, as if both candidates were normal politicians. It's frightening to me how close it came. Now, this is not a political podcast. I'm concerned with predictable long-term trends, not the politics of the moment. But this election was such a momentous event that I can't help but vent about it just a little. At least I can make some predictions about the next 4 years based on what demographics and macroeconomics tell us. I have no idea what is going to happen in America in the next week or even the next year. I don't have that kind of crystal ball. Demographics and macroeconomics yield predictions over a longer term. I feel more comfortable making forecasts over the next 4 to 8 years or the term of the next president. Spoiler alert, that future looks pretty bleak. The systemic disintegration of the economy continues, regardless of who is president, but it might be progressing just a little slower now that the president of the United States isn't making things worse. I guess I should be grateful to Donald Trump for one thing. He was responsible for my demographic doom project and ultimately this podcast. My passion for demography was born 4 years ago on November 9, 2016, the day after Trump was elected. Like many others on this planet, I was shell-shocked. I asked myself, how could so many people be so stupid? This launched me into the study of populations and what could be happening to them. Demography seemed natural because elections are, by definition, masses of people doing things. Once I got into it, I found that the problem was far bigger than Trump. He was more of a symptom of dysfunction than its cause. The real issue was the progressive deterioration of the economic systems that we all depend on. Voters were hurting, so they lashed out in the only way they had, which is to vote for the protest candidate that all the experts told them not to vote for. You might want to check out the video I recorded 2 days after the 2016 election, which tells you what I was thinking at the time. The link is found in the video version of this episode, or you can search YouTube for Demographic Doom Glenn Campbell Trump in that order. That video, recorded in Florida, marked the birth of my demographic project, although it took me a while to achieve its current formulation. After I started inquiring into demography, the first surprising thing I learned was that the so-called population explosion, treated as gospel by my generation, was in fact a lie. Most countries of the world are on the brink of a population implosion, and this reversal of growth is having a lot of devastating economic effects. It means, for one thing, that there will be a ton of old people in the world and relatively few workers to support them. This is ultimately expressed by debt, which is either explicit debt on the books right now or implied debt called unfunded liabilities, which are debts we know are coming down the road. For example, we know a certain number of people will be filing for Social Security in coming years, even though they haven't done it yet. Demographic problems inevitably turn into macroeconomic problems, where we are looking at the state of the whole monetary system. The state of our current monetary system is dire, and it was dire even before COVID, because there are clearly more debts in the world than can possibly be paid back. Nearly all forms of debt are problematic these days, be it government debt, corporate debt, consumer debt, or student loan debt. There's no magic wand you can wave to make all those debts go away. There are magic wands that seem to make the debt go away, but they're just kicking the can down the road and ultimately making the problems worse. The Federal Reserve can print money or hold interest rates at zero. Maybe the incoming president can wave a magic wand and make student loans disappear. But as you might suspect, all these magic solutions come at a cost. Eventually the magic runs out and backfires on you. The bottom line is that without unrealistic economic growth, which is based largely on population growth, most of the debts of the world are simply unpayable and are destined to fail. If you look at government debt alone, it's just astounding how much there is and how much new debt has been accumulated in the wake of the pandemic. This year, in 2020, the U.S. government will spend at least twice as much money as it received in taxes. And the shortfall is ultimately being covered through money printing and interest rate suppression. These are sleight-of-hand tricks that can't go on forever. Sooner or later, the system has to fail catastrophically, and I'm betting it's going to start during the Biden administration. When we dumped Trump for Biden, we gained only momentary relief in that the President of the United States of America is no longer actively trying to destroy the United States of America. I think everyone on the planet can breathe a sigh of relief for that, but I'm not inclined to celebrate in the street. The demographic crisis, the debt crisis, and the money printing crisis are all still with us. The Titanic has struck the iceberg, and there's nothing even the most organized and well-intentioned government can do about it. The ship is going down. But before I move on to that happy news, let me do a little analysis of the 4-year Trump administration and how it might have changed our demographics. Demography is concerned with the big picture. What are whole populations doing? To begin with, Trump actively killed a fair number of Americans. As of today, roughly 250,000 Americans have died from the coronavirus. There is little doubt that a more organized federal response would have reduced that number. Let's say it might have been only 100,000 who would have died if America had been on top of this thing from day one, which leaves only 150,000 deaths that Trump might be blamed for. That's certainly a devastating toll for the people and families involved, but from a demographic standpoint, it's a drop in the bucket. There are 328 million people in the United States, so even if we have 1 million COVID deaths, it won't significantly impact our population profile. I'm not trying to minimize the suffering and societal costs involved. I'm only saying that COVID deaths alone don't change our long-term population trajectory. I guess if you want to congratulate Trump for something, he might have saved some elder care costs. Among the casualties of Trump's incompetence, the majority seem to be older Americans, that is, retirement age and above, who you can cynically argue weren't really producing much for America anyway. If someone is killed at age 70 instead of living to age 85, the U.S. has saved 15 years of Social Security and Medicare costs and pension disbursements because of that. So congratulations, Mr. Trump. I guess there's a silver lining in this. And you do hear a lot of this reasoning in the right-wing media. These people were going to die anyway, they say, and the virus just killed them off a little sooner. I'm a little sensitive about that argument personally because I'm starting to be labeled as older myself, and I don't think my days of productivity are over. I'm not eager to be part of a culling of the herd, and I'd rather not be killed by COVID or bad government policy, but that's just me. Rather than getting sucked into this debate, I just want to point out that the cost saving in COVID deaths is still statistically insignificant. killing off, say, 100,000 retirees won't rescue Social Security or Medicare. The long-term numbers are still terrible. There are still too many people retiring with not enough workers to support them. Demographically, I think COVID deaths are a lot less significant Trump disaster than damage to U.S. immigration. Trump has poisoned the well by making immigration to the U.S. much more odious. It hasn't just restricted immigration at the border. He has made America much less appealing to potential immigrants overseas who haven't even applied yet. The Trump administration has essentially been a 4-year worldwide television ad for the dysfunction and xenophobia of America. Like every other developed country, America is in desperate need of high-quality immigrants to make up for our own lack of births, and Trump has decimated our marketing effort. Immigrants, especially skilled ones, are a winning proposition for the receiving country because they usually go to work immediately and start paying taxes immediately without that country having to pay for their upbringing and education. It's a losing proposition for the country the immigrants came from, but it's mostly positive for any country fortunate enough to be able to attract talented immigrants. Sadly, Trump has made the U.S. a lot less attractive for these skilled workers. If you are a trained professional from, say, Asia, and you had your choice of emigrating to the U.S. or to Germany, the U.S. has really lost its sheen. I can't quantify this, but it will eventually show up in immigration statistics for highly skilled workers. I predict that the cost to the country of lost immigration appeal will be far greater than the money saved by killing off 100,000 seniors. So what's my overall assessment of the Trump administration? Well, it's not good. I don't need to belabor the point, but he did not, in fact, make America great again. He made America a pariah that no talented foreign professional would want to move to. In this podcast, I'm attracted to things that are predictable. Demographics are predictable in that you know for a fact that you're not going to have more tax-paying workers 20 years from now than you have children today, unless, of course, you import them. Macroeconomics is also predictable, mainly in one critical assumption. In the long run, you can't spend more money than you make. I know some people are going to argue with that. Since the government runs the printing press, it can print as much money as it wants, but this experiment always ends badly. Always. Unrestrained money creation has ended badly in the past, and it will end badly in the future, even if the effects are delayed. I can't tell you how or when it will end, but it will end. And if I had to place a bet on when the bad ending will get going, I'd say it will happen within the next 4 to 8 years. Beyond that broad framework, specific predictions for how things will fail are very difficult. Over the past 4.5 years, a lot of things happened that I never would have guessed. Who could have predicted in 2015 that Donald Trump would become president? No one could have predicted the appearance of the coronavirus, at least in its timing and origin, although plenty of scientists have warned that something like this was destined to happen. The most stunning surprise to me is how the devastating economics of the pandemic has led to a rise in stock markets. Now, it may no longer be true by the time you listen to this, but right now some markets are at all-time highs in spite of the horrible state of the economy. Furthermore, I never would have predicted that the government could have printed so much money without triggering massive consumer inflation. By all rights, we should be in Zimbabwe inflation territory by now, but we're not. If I tried to make specific predictions about any of these things, I would have been wrong. But I'm still confident of my broader macroeconomic and demographic predictions, as I expressed in earlier podcasts. In my podcast number 22 on December 13th, 2019, that is before the coronavirus, I predicted the 2020s would be a horrible, devastating decade for the world economy. I and others speculated that an unknown black swan would trigger a collapse, but we couldn't have known what that bird would be. That's how demographics and macroeconomics work. You can predict rising tensions that have to be resolved somehow, but you can't say exactly how and when the reckoning will happen. You know that a lot of dynamite has been accumulated, but you don't know what spark will set it off. Compared to the Trump administration, we know that the Biden administration is going to be relatively competent, filled with smart, capable people who genuinely care about the country. But I have doubts about how much competence can accomplish on a sinking ship. If you change the management on the Titanic after it has already struck the iceberg, you might be able to reduce the loss of life through, say, more organized use of lifeboats. But all the competence in the world can't stop the ship from sinking. Our demographic ship started sinking in the 1960s with the invention of reliable birth control, and our macroeconomic ship started sinking in the last global financial crisis around 2009, or maybe decades earlier, depending on how you look at it. You can't put these genies back in their bottles. What we are destined to have during the Biden administration is a ton of things falling apart in rapid succession. I can't tell you what will fall apart and in what order, but conceptually the ship has struck the iceberg and has already taken in enough water to sink it. It's just taking the ship a while to figure that out. So many systems are falling apart that it's hard to know where to begin, but there are a couple of pending collapses that should be obvious to anyone looking at things from afar. One crisis is overvalued assets like stocks, bonds, and real estate. These pigs can't continue to fly while the real economy is in the pits. There has to be a reckoning sooner or later. Another obvious crisis is that no government can keep printing money forever. Something has to break, even though I don't know what that something is. A government, like an individual, can't consistently spend more money than it makes. A government's income is called taxes, which are based on economic activity. If economic activity falls, as it has done during the pandemic, then taxes will fall too, even as the government is spending more than it ever has before. You can keep the Ponzi scheme afloat as long as your economy is growing, but ours isn't growing and never again will because we don't have enough workers and consumers. This Ponzi scheme is going to fall the way they always do, with the sudden realization that there's not nearly as much value in the system as everyone thought there was. Imagine what it would take for the U.S. government to balance its books. In the current environment, it would have to either double taxes or cut its spending in half, both of which are politically and practically impossible. The third option is incredible economic growth, which just isn't going to happen even if the pandemic is resolved. The Federal Reserve is locked into a self-reinforcing regime of money printing and artificially low interest rates, which are eroding the foundations of financial systems, and there's literally no way out. There is no coherent theory anyone can offer for how this ends gracefully. The end can only be compared to the fall of Rome, but probably a whole lot faster. Joe Biden comes into office with a mission to fix the country, but he can't. The main crisis isn't the virus, but the economic collapse that was destined to happen anyway. Any relief from the virus or the economic pain involves spending still more money that the government doesn't have. For example, Biden can try to enact another stimulus program to send free money to citizens, but that's only temporary relief that creates as many problems as it solves. It's not going to repair anything, only delay the inevitable. Nothing Biden can do will stop baby boomers from retiring en masse, or at least reaching retirement age, where they get a lot less productive and a whole lot more expensive. That time bomb has been ticking since the 1960s, and no government policy is going to defuse it. Likewise, nothing Biden can do will neutralize the massive debts the government and private sector have accumulated, debts that can't possibly be repaid. By definition, debts that keep growing without reprieve must eventually end in some form of default, which wipes out the wealth of everyone who holds that debt. Debt forgiveness sounds like a good idea until you realize that somebody has to lose. And it isn't always fat cat capitalists. Retirees may lose their homes when their pension funds fail because they invested in risky bonds. When debts don't get paid, wealth simply vanishes. It magically goes away, and suddenly people who thought they were well off find they are poor. That's one of the things I'm predicting in the next 4 to 8 years, a massive evaporation of wealth. People who thought they were wealthy will find out that it was an illusion. And there are two ways that this can happen. The price of assets can crash, or inflation can erode the value of those assets. For example, if you own a home valued at $1 million, you might think you are rich. But that valuation can change very quickly. Your home's perceived value is based on recent sales of comparable homes in your neighborhood. There's no guarantee that you will actually get $1 million when you come to sell. We saw that happen in 2008 and 2009. People who thought they had $1 million homes found that they could sell for only a fraction of that, if indeed anyone wanted to buy. In that case, if you sold for $500,000, that other $500,000 that you thought you had simply vanished, or more properly, it never really existed to begin with. Inflation works differently, but the net result is the same. Let's say you manage to sell your house for $1 million, but the buying power of $1 million has eroded due to inflation. You still have $1 million in the bank, but it might buy only what $500,000 bought a few years ago. What really matters is the purchasing power of the money, not the money itself. And 50% is roughly the magnitude I'm predicting. In the next 4 to 8 years, I predict that most assets will fall in value by at least a half, either through price crashes or inflation. I'm talking about nearly all assets: stocks, bonds, real estate, fine art, anything an investor put their money into to try to preserve or increase their wealth. The only exemption I might grudgingly make is gold. I really don't understand gold, so I don't want to make any predictions about it. Gold is something without much practical value that is worth whatever investors think it's worth, so it is speculative like every other asset. The only assets that aren't speculative are things that people actually use to stay alive, like food and grain. I had a podcast about grain. It was episode number 7, about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Roman Empire ran on grain. That's what powered all of its operations. Farmers produced grain, which was taxed by the empire, and that grain was carried around and used to pay soldiers and bureaucrats and build all those monuments. The empire got in trouble when it started spending more grain than it produced. In the minds of some scholars, that's what really caused the fall of Rome: deficit spending. Based on its grain production, the empire had more obligations than it could make good on, and there's no easy fix. You can't tax the farmers too much, or you end up starving them to death. The same idea applies to our society. There's a core production of taxable activity, which is taxed to pay for government operations, and for years the U.S. government has been spending far more than that. The government can't raise taxes too high or it kills production, so it's stuck with a finite income and infinitely growing debts. You can't spend more money than you make because ultimately you got to produce the grain to pay all those debts, or the whole house of cards collapses. Similar insanity applies to stocks. A stock is a slice of the future profits of a company. You might buy a company like Tesla not because it is profitable now, but because you think it will be profitable in the future. But those profits would have to be truly massive to justify the current stock price. As of today, Tesla stock is close to $500 a share compared to $86 a share at the beginning of the year. That is, before the pandemic. That's a 6-fold increase in price in spite of this economic downturn, which will almost certainly hurt car sales. I don't want to get into a debate about the merits of Tesla. My point is the entire stock market in the U.S. is vastly overvalued in relation to the future profits that are likely to be generated. You can argue about specific companies and their prospects, but the overvaluation of the whole market is measurable. You can judge it by something called the market capitalization to GDP ratio, otherwise known as the Buffett indicator after Warren Buffett. If you add up all the values of all the stocks on all the U.S. stock markets, you get a big number for the total book value of the stock market. You then compare that number to the total GDP of the country and you get a percentage. Traditionally, if market capitalization is between 75% and 90% of GDP, the market is said to be fairly valued. Today's ratio is something like 175%, which suggests that the total market is overvalued by a factor of 2. In other words, to make markets rational again, stocks would have to fall by 50%, which is what I thought would happen back in March. Instead, we got an insane boom in stock prices, at least here in the U.S. In the past few days, the Dow Jones average and the S&P have reached all-time highs. That's in spite of the pandemic and in spite of the enormous economic hit that we've taken. There are a lot of explanations for this, including the announcement of 2 potential coronavirus vaccines, but it's still insane no matter how you slice it. Even if they distribute a vaccine tomorrow, a lot of damage has been done to the economy that won't go away anytime soon. When the bubble bursts, it won't be just wealthy investors that lose. When wealth vanishes, everyone loses, including people who own no stocks but lose their jobs when rich people stop buying things. Politics, of course, is much harder to predict. Who in 2015 could have predicted Trump's election? It was just so outlandish. What is not outlandish, however, are the economic instabilities that give rise to this kind of anarchy. You can't predict specific incidents like who will rise to power or which act of terrorism will come next, but you can predict that the conditions remain ripe for extremism. As the economy deteriorates for ordinary voters, the conditions are optimal for another Trump-like character to arise. What are these economic conditions? In a word, it's misery. Misery is real among the electorate, and it is measurable. It mainly has to do with wealth inequality. In recent decades, the rich have been getting richer while everyone else gets poorer. The dim-witted voter doesn't know what has gone wrong. All he knows is that he's a lot less comfortable in life than he used to be. This change in circumstances leads to rage, which is often directed at the wrong targets. Another thing I never would have predicted in 2020 was race riots in the middle of a pandemic. But in retrospect, it makes sense. The riots were triggered by black people dying in police custody. But whether this sort of thing is ignored or triggers an explosion depends on how much social dynamite has already been stored up, and evidently there's a lot of it. I wouldn't say that race is the key issue in these race riots. I think income inequality is the key issue because white Trump supporters are feeling the same thing. Everyone has the sense that their life is pretty miserable right now, but different groups pick different targets for their rage. Rage can be expressed by burning down Kenosha, Wisconsin, or by villainizing immigrants, or by voting for an obvious psychopath. If the economic misery becomes too great, the rage becomes unstoppable, and a lot more than Kenosha, Wisconsin gets burned down. The election of Joe Biden may have brought America a brief reprieve, but the core economic misery has not been relieved, and I don't think it can be. When the economy collapses even further and people are even more miserable than they are now, there will be more unrest and more rage directed at convenient targets. The most convenient target of all is the current government, which will inevitably be blamed for economic problems that have been incubating for decades. When bad things happen and Biden gets blamed, it is likely that another Trump-like character will arise to channel that voter rage. You can't predict now who that will be or how he will take power. The only thing I dare predict right now is that it will be a he and not a she, and that he will be a whole lot smarter and more Machiavellian than Trump ever was. As an American and a world citizen, I'm relieved that we are finally rid of Trump. That is, if he actually leaves, but I'm still deeply worried. The 2016 election could be seen as a fluke, a vote for a protest candidate that no one knew very well. But 2020 proved that it's not a fluke. After 4 years of hell, 47% of voters wanted that hell to continue. And the people who wanted the hell the most seemed to be the white Christians. In 2016, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, and it looks like that number hasn't changed much in 2020. I just can't fathom this. Here is the most unchristian man on the planet, who in my mind embodies pure biblical evil, and Christians are willing to set aside all of their professed beliefs to vote for him. Some of them even think he is the second coming of Christ, quite literally. Over the past 4 years, Trump made every political blunder imaginable, and it didn't sink in with these people. Trump was opposed in this election by a vast juggernaut of celebrities, comedians, respected past leaders, and experts of all stripes, and it made no difference. Roughly half of America is willing to vote for a craven, self-serving autocrat, and we shouldn't feel comforted that less than half actually made it to the polls. If Trump had only been slightly more clever, or the opposition had been slightly less effective, the election would have gone to this despot again. This can only happen a few more times before America becomes an autocracy. And all of those conditions are still in place. 47% of Americans stand ready to vote for a would-be dictator, and they need only 3% more to make it happen. Even if Trump is gone, the infrastructure for autocracy is already in place. It's called the Republican Party. Like white evangelicals, the Republicans have abandoned all pretexts of principles in favor of the naked pursuit of power. In my mind, Democrats have a lot of kooky ideas, but Republicans, or at least those elected to power, seem to have no ideas at all. Still, 40% of the electorate will support them no matter what. All they need is that 3%, which can be easily delivered to them by the growing economic misery I'm predicting. Trump's saving grace was his stupidity. He wanted to become a dictator in the same way that Dr. Evil really wanted to rule the world, but he was just too egotistical and self-destructive to pull it off. Every time he tried to implement a nefarious scheme, he himself would sabotage it. I predict that the next would-be autocrat will not be so dumb. So subscribe to this podcast for more observations from a demographic philosopher. In the next episodes, I hope to get back to my post-nuclear family, where I still have a lot of explaining to do. I encourage your input. If you have anything to say, you can email me or post a comment to the YouTube version of this episode. My contact information is found in the YouTube description.